Yeah, this is a multi-authored presentation, and yeah, there are apologies from a number of people. Lockie will probably join in at different times, and we've actually got 3 presentations back to back, so it's going to cover a fair bit of ground, so apologies for having to listen for an extended period. The first presentation is dealing with the work we're doing. This is the Ngarrindjeri Regional Authority doing with Duna on a work to do with rewriting or redrafting the ecological character description for the Coorong Lower Lakes and Ramsar area. I'd just like to start off too at the beginning by acknowledging that we're on the lands of the Kaurna Nation, and acknowledge their elders and leaders and young people, and the work that they do to maintain the health of these lands and waters. So recognise the organisers of the conference, Dr. Jenny Fluhan particularly, and also pay respects to Ngarrindjeri people who've passed, and let people know that there are images of people who've passed in this presentation. Several of these papers have been put together over a number of years, so there are people who would be authors on these presentations but are no longer here, so they appear in some of the presentations. Just recognise other Ngarrindjeri people within the audience and other Indigenous leaders and elders who might be here to listen. I guess what we're talking about is a long-term project, or I guess a case study in engaging with natural resource management, water management in the Coorong Lower Lakes part of the state. And a lot of this work came about because of responses from the state to the Millennium Drought, and a lot of work that was going to go on in this part of South Australia. The Ngarrindjeri Nation at the time decided to take a particular strategy of engagement and looked at setting up a couple of things, new things. One was an agreement-making strategy using contract law, and set about writing a sea country plan for the region, which actually set the baseline for what Ngarrindjeri people think about the region. So from a Ngarrindjeri perspective, it's Ngarrindjeri Yalawarui, which means sea country, body. It's a sort of a collective kind of name for the whole of the space. The Ngarrindjeri Sea Country Plan was put together in 2007, about the same time as the first ecological character description for the region, 2006. And this plan was actually launched by Premier Wetherell, was actually Minister Wetherell at the time, and is recognised as being a document that's given status alongside of the ecological character description at the time. It's a lengthy document. It talks about cultural values. It talks about aspirations for engaging in a range of areas from fishing through to natural resource management, heritage and water. It's online if anyone wants to have a look at it. Within the plan, what Ngarrindjeri people were doing was communicating their values and their understandings of country to non-Indigenous people. And these are some of the elders I was talking about who've passed, who were heavily involved in a lot of the planning, was involved in this work. There are a lot of other elders as well and leaders who were involved. But Daryle Rigney today, who would have been here today, or Grant Rigney, who are both part of authors of these papers. Their father is Matt Rigney, and Luke Trevorrow, who would have been presenting. His father is Uncle Tom Trevorrow there, and George Trevorrow, who was the Rupali of the nation. So basically what people were arguing was that the land and waters is a living body, and that Ngarrindjeri people are part of that living body, and also that Ngarrindjeri people need to speak as country. So that was a message that was being developed sort of in the early 2000s, and is consistent with what Ngarrindjeri people have been arguing to non-Indigenous people for a long time. In 2009, with the Murray Futures projects that were emerging, Ngarrindjeri wanted to be part of those programs, but wanted to be part of the programs in a central way. So there was a significant amount of negotiation. A contract law agreement was signed, and the Ngarrindjeri Partnerships project was set up at that stage. So a significant amount of infrastructure was set up to actually engage around projects like rewriting the ecological character description. That included agreements, statement of commitments, protection of cultural knowledge agreements and other processes, including a joint working party made up of Duna employees and Ngarrindjeri people and researchers to actually jointly write the ECD. It's not finished yet, it's still in process. The Ngarrindjeri process developed into something called a Ngarrindjeri assessment process. So initially there was the idea to maybe draft up a cultural character description, but the group moved away from that idea into more of an assessment process. So what was eventually done was set up a process for looking at the health of Ngarrindjeri Yalawā from the perspective of Ngarrindjeri values. It's a bit of a risk assessment tool. So if a particular event is predicted, like building a barrage or bringing in a new ecological character description, what would be the impact of that on the health of Ngarrindjeri Yalawā, taking into account that includes all of the community, the people, as well as the lands, the waters, and the spirit of the lands. So this is this is a table that represents that. We'll come back to this in the last presentation, but gives you a quick snapshot. So it's identifying core values that Ngarrindjeri leaders and elders have always had to use to assess how they would engage with something, how they behave in everyday life, and try to apply those to assess any particular thing that's put on the table. So you look at 1985, the listing of the Ramsar site. We do an assessment of well-being for that particular period based on creation law, interconnectivity, which is Rui Rua, everything needs to be connected. Miwi is spiritual connection. How does it impact on people's spiritual connection to country and how they feel? The responsibility to the speaker's country, and the issue of proper relationships, Ngarrindjeri, which is you've got to have respectful relationships and partnerships. So an assessment of all of those factors with Ngarrindjeri language terms for assessment as to whether they're sick, healthy, bad, reproductive, and come out with an assessment at the end. You could take that assessment and apply it to 1836 or 1910 and do a similar kind of assessment. And it allows Ngarrindjeri to include all of the things that are important rather than isolate off just components of country. There's some key lessons that were learnt, I guess, in engaging with the ecological character description process. I guess one is that the actual ecological character description process itself is not very well set up for engaging with Indigenous knowledges and interests and worldviews. It's also very much designed from a scientific approach to environmental management with a social and economic tack on at the end, which doesn't necessarily allow for concepts like reproduction of well-being to be included. It's very much a one-way flow towards services rather than, I guess, a circular loop of reproduction. We came up with the idea that there needs to be formal agreements in place. There's got to be agreements around cultural knowledge. You're talking about very sensitive issues. There needs to be inclusion of worldviews and values in the space. There needs to be a collaborative approach that leads into ongoing research and monitoring, as well as management. You need joint working parties, and Indigenous people need to be part of the research and writing team. So we're lucky enough to have a number of Indigenous people in that space. Daryle Rigney, professor at Flinders, is one of the members of the writing team. Is that the next one? Yeah. Second dot point there I think is fairly crucial is that components, processes and ecosystem services are interconnected through a concept of reciprocal interconnected benefit. And in a way that Ngarrindjeri and Rui Rua actually would translate as reciprocal interconnected benefit and the responsibility that goes with that. There's no such thing as natural condition, so the idea that the South Australia was in a natural state before non-Indigenous people arrived seems to be a problem for a lot of the language within ECDs. Often human-induced change is used in the documents, and it's not recognised that human-induced change is basically non-Indigenous human-induced change. So there's a kind of leaving out of Indigenous people within the story and the dialogue. Scientists and Indigenous people often share key principles and values. So those values and principles that Ngarrindjeri have identified, when you put them on the table and work with scientists, there's a lot of commonality in that space. So one of the ideas in this project was to try to develop a protocol that actually identify the key values for the site that might be shared between Indigenous people and scientists, and use that as a possibility. So concepts like flow, connectivity and sustainability were also embedded in the Ngarrindjeri values. Indigenous worldviews understand that the relationship between human and nature are reproductive and not separate. Came up with some key recommendations that I won't go through, but there's a couple here that are probably worth drawing attention to. The Indigenous peoples working on ECDs probably need to have direct access to the Commonwealth Government to actually explain where they're coming from, worldviews. That Indigenous nations should be supported to continue their unique roles in the reproduction of healthy wetlands. This principle should be prioritised as a critical and socially just component of wise use and a test of responsible wetland management. All wetland management plans and ecological character descriptions should recognise that Australia was managed by Indigenous people prior to colonisation, and that the resilience of Indigenous people post-settlement has significantly contributed to the health of Australian wetlands and river systems. And I guess the work that Ngarrindjeri have done over the last number of years in conjunction with government and NRM boards and others just shows how that commitment to country is so critical to support looking after country, and that needs to be recognised. And the people need resources to help co-develop these documents, and also promote the idea of co-management of Ramsar sites. This approach was developed also in other projects, like the Ngarrindjeri Recovery Project or Riverine Recovery Project, where it was used on a smaller scale with wetlands. So that developing a NRM assessment of a wetland, for instance, enables you to bring in Indigenous values in that space. That might deal with issues like, does the NRM board recognise the local Indigenous people through agreements? Does the local white landowner actually work closely with Indigenous people and allow access to that space? Is there opportunities for Indigenous people to make a living in that place? They're the kinds of questions you might ask in the NRM assessment. And just acknowledgements. This project's been going, I guess, since 1836, but it's speeded up in the last sort of decade, and I guess people have been contributed to it for a long time. But the Ngarrindjeri Partnerships project secured over $5 million to actually enable Ngarrindjeri to build capacity to engage with government on projects like the ecological character description. I think the essential part of the learning from it was that there's need for ongoing long-term funding for Indigenous nations and groups to actually engage in these sorts of complex projects. How am I going for time?
I think that's it.
Yep, cool. Shall I go to the next one? Go for questions.
I think, thanks very much, Steve.
Add to that.